welcome all to the panel event moderated by Social Enterprise Institute at Northeastern and Arise Impact. I'm Sabiha Shirol, a graduate student at College of Engineering, and I'm pursuing my master's in industrial engineering, and I'm also the Chief Operating Officer of Arise Impact. Tonight I will be moderating this event with Isha Ramanujam. Isha is currently a student in the School of Business at Northeastern University, and she is pursuing her Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration. Today we have gathered over here to discuss about how we can use education technology to serve the marginalized communities. You would be wondering what is education technology or Edtech. It is defined as the study of facilitating learning and improving performance by creating, using, and managing appropriate technological processes and resources. You would be thinking, why would we have to know about education technology? Through the use of education technology, education is able to be individualized for each particular student, allowing for better differentiation and allowing students to work for mastery at their own pace, in their own domains. Today, to shed more light about EdTech for good, we have our three amazing panelists. Isabel Fethi, Community Engagement Fellow at UNICEF USA, Abhishek Sayal, alumni at MIT and founder Arise Impact India, and Melissa Cotto, co-founder and CEO of Education Modified. Isabel is the Community Engagement Fellow at UNICEF USA. She has served as grassroots and national spokespersons for children and brought together networks of faith-based communities, schools, universities, volunteers, advocates, elected leaders, and others to unite on behalf of children. She also mobilized communities by engaging local groups and cultivating awareness. Abhishek here is the founder of Arise Impact, as I said before. He has invented Map and Diagram Reader and is a MIT TR 35 under 35 India innovator. Arise Impact as a company has impacted around 1,000 differently able students by enabling self-learning, increasing self-confidence, and language fluency. Arise Impact aims to help innovate, create, develop, and disseminate tools and technologies for the cause of social education to the challenged community. Arise Impact has been awarded South Asia's Best NGO for Mobile Usage at the eNGO Awards in 2014. Also, Arise Impact works with partners like UNB Online Volunteering Services, MIT, Imperial College London for online volunteering. Melissa here is the co-founder and CEO of Education Modified, and Education Modified has created a platform to help teachers collaborate more efficiently and reach all types of learners. The mission is to bring 21st century technology to teaching and innovating special education by providing teachers with the tools necessary to focus on what is important while also focusing and increasing achievement for all the students. Tonight's panel will start with the big question to be answered by our panelists, and then Isha will start with the questionnaire, and at the end we'll finally take questions by the audience, or we can rearrange if you guys have any questions in between. So let me start by asking the big question to each of our panelists. How do you think education technology can be used for doing good? And focus your answers on using it to benefit the marginalized communities. And we would like to start with Abhishek.
I believe EdTech can really help bring in individualized education. So think about developing resources for each individual needs, rather than just for the class, but thinking about the individual per se. I believe this is very similar to kind of marketing automation that's going on, as we have developed software programs that can create customized content on the fly, as well as target the individual recommendations over email newsletters. Similarly, we could create custom resources on the fly for education based on the individual profile. That's my viewpoint.
Yep. Melissa.
Yeah, sure. So I taught high school in New York City public schools for 9 years in a Title I at-risk school, and one of the biggest problems that I faced as a teacher and I watched all my colleagues face was just the lack of technology, and the industry was so antiquated compared to every other industry. in which we were still using, I still had a clipboard and sticky notes to keep track of things in my classroom, and that was just something I couldn't get over as a teacher. You know, I have an app on my phone that tells me what I should eat for breakfast, how many steps I should take in a day, you know, who I should marry, but I don't know what to do for the individual kids in my class, right? And so that's where I think the power of EdTech really holds, just not just for individualized instruction, but really to transform an industry or you know, an entire industry that has not moved forward yet.
So I think UNICEF is probably a little different from both of you. So when we're talking about EdTech, what can be done for good, and when we're focusing our answer on marginalized communities, I think the first thing that we want to look to is what's the issue? Because UNICEF works in over 190 countries all over the world, and we focus on reaching the most vulnerable children in the world, the kids that are most hard to reach, that are most at risk. And when we look at these populations, we see that education has definitely improved for the past decades for millions of kids, which is amazing. But for far too many of the world's disadvantaged children, they remain excluded from school, and many of children in school do not learn the basic skills they need to lead productive lives. In fact, around the world, 59 million children are missing out on a basic primary school education. And education systems around the globe must do much more than just increase resources and encourage kids excluded from school just because of location, gender, disability, you know, ethnic origin, violence. Addressing these huge challenges requires a lot more than just doing business as usual. So UNICEF is kind of at the forefront of that, and for us it's not just about technology. Educational innovation can be found in the processes, it can be found in the services, in our programs, and in our partnerships. To be innovative, an idea or approach must be effective. It has to gain traction, and it has to have the capacity to function on necessary scales. So that's kind of the way that UNICEF looks at you know, how we are looking at education and how we can improve access to marginalized communities, in particular kids.
Alrighty, so we're going to start with a list of questions that we have prepared for you. So all of you kind of already addressed the problem that you're trying to solve, but more specifically, what do you see as your target community when we're talking about EdTech or when we're talking about educational reform? Because there are a lot of marginalized communities, so who do you see as your target audience for your particular product? And if we can start with Isabel.
Sure. So for us, our target community are kids, in particular the world's most vulnerable children. And like I said before, there are currently 59 million children around the world who do not have access to a primary school education. How many of you guys can remember a favorite elementary school teacher? Yeah. Imagine if you had never had that person in your life, and how different your life may be today. Yeah. So that's kind of the issue that UNICEF is facing. How do we get kids the opportunity to have that experience? You know, it's not just a privilege, it's a basic right. Kids need education to, you know, develop throughout. And in particular, I think I'm going to focus a lot on children with disabilities because they are one of the most marginalized and excluded groups in society. They're facing daily discrimination in the forms of negative attitudes, lack of adequate policies and legislation, and they are effectively barred from realizing their rights to healthcare, education, and even survival. And of course, I'm going to be speaking more on just education, right? But estimates suggest that there are 93 million children with disabilities in the world. And when I give you that number, I also want you to realize that this is an estimate. This number can vary widely, especially because there's no real monitoring or data collection on the amount of individuals with disabilities. Governments are supposed to be doing a census on populations and seeing where their populations are, in particular with individuals with disabilities, and a lot of countries are not doing that. So in terms of the data that we may have, in terms of this population, it's really scarce, and that makes the job that much more difficult.
Yep, I definitely agree with that that there's not enough access to resources for children with disabilities. What ARISE focuses on is children in 3rd to 12th grade in India who are studying with non-profit schools, basically very special schools, not in the integrated classroom environment. The reason being, typically, children who are studying separately in a separate school, they have more severity of disability as compared to children who are generally in an integrated environment. So that's another key point, is also that we don't monitor, is the severity of the disability. And that kind of also drives to the point is that even though there are being resources that are developed, but not enough research, and actually field research is not being done to develop very custom resources for the severity of the disability. So that is where we come in, particularly with respect to the fact to help create a platform where we can develop self-learning resources. And our idea for being very hyper-specialized in self-learning was because that we already have these schools which have teachers, they do have their own programs that are happening. We don't want to cut them out. We don't want to eradicate them. Our aim is how to make that experience better. So think about it this way. In 2006, when I started doing my research on Map and Diagram Reader, I realized, the first thing which I realized was that the visually challenged students, they read from tactile maps and diagrams. And what is happening is that they would have to explore this tactile map and diagram. And tactile map and diagram is basically a diagram of raised objects. So each child would explore it slightly differently. So you do need an individualized attention of the teacher to help the child understand the tactile map and diagram and understand the information contained in it. So from that standpoint, it's a very labor-intensive process, and the child really needs an individualized attention. So if you're thinking about creating solutions for children with severe disabilities, then we need to come up with more customized or more individualized kind of materials that they can learn on their own without the need of the labor-intensive process. So that was the kind of holistic idea, is how do we create a platform around that? How do we create resources around that? How do we develop research and develop our proprietary methodologies for content creation, also for kind of giving out and involving the students themselves in the part of making the content, so that they also feel ownership, and then they can access these content whenever, wherever, and feel like they don't have to depend on someone else to learn. That's the biggest feeling that we help eradicate in these children in our target population.
So our target population is teachers, and then indirectly students with special needs in an inclusive classroom. So when I was trying to talk about severity of special needs, I taught in an inclusive classroom. I taught in all settings in a public school, but I taught in an inclusive classroom that we include kids with ADHD, dyslexia, mild or severe autism spectrum disorder, all sorts of different diverse needs, as I particularly like to call them. However, so in 1975, IDEA was passed, in which includes all students with disabilities to a free and appropriate education. However, our system was never prepared to do that. So in a New York City public school, teachers can have up to 35 kids in a class, and up to 15% of those kids can have a diagnosed disability. And 88% of public school teachers are never trained in special education, which is one problem. And then the other one is that the job is so stinking hard that 50% leave within 3 to 5 years. And so there's no traction of professional memory. However, a lot of research has come out around neurodiversity. So 60% of entrepreneurs self-diagnose themselves as being dyslexic. ADHD and ADD has kind of merged into this spectrum where we have a lot of research around this kind of neurodiversity, and none of that information gets into the classroom for special ed teachers. And even if it does, it doesn't last, right? So teachers, if they do read something, they don't know how to apply it in the classroom, or they don't stay long enough in the classroom to be able to appropriately differentiate for those types of kids. So I created Education Modified so that teachers can access that kind of research and use technology to track exactly what's working and what's not working for individual kids. So our target population is teachers, and then indirectly helps students. And it's interesting because where you go, like Boston Public Schools has one of the highest rates of inclusion for kids with disabilities. It's at almost 26%, where the national average is 12 to 13%, which could be for a lot of different reasons, because there's a lot of medical facilities, so kids might get diagnosed better or more appropriately or earlier. However, Boston Public Schools has one of the least inclusive practices in public education, in which kids are still kept in a separate classroom. They're not included with their peers. They still have very low graduation rates, so kids with diagnosed disabilities in Boston Public Schools are about half as likely to graduate high school on time. And so we're looking to, we have all this research and we have all this knowledge, but again, the system just hasn't caught up, and so that's why that's our target.
Thank you. So what do you think is most innovative about your product, your solution, your business model, organizational structure, supply chain? What do you think the projects that you work on in particular focus on as their main innovation? So if you want to start.
Sure. So again, we created a platform which automatically recommends research-based strategies based on a child and their special needs. So if we know so-and-so has dyslexia, we plug into the grade book that teachers are already using to recommend those strategies. So right now, teachers are logging into technology every day, whether it's a grade book or a student information system or a learning management system. But right now, none of those programs directly address kids with special needs. And so we take what we already know about a kid and we plug into the learning management system so that teachers don't have to log into something else and they don't have to learn a new system. And we can use the data that they're entering every day. So that's an innovative approach that we take. None of our competitors are doing that. We have an open API where we integrate directly so that teachers, when they're doing their grading and when they're doing attendance and standards and all of that, we can plug right in. And so that's something that we learned from our early users that we kind of had to pivot around to listen. So teachers didn't want something else to log into.
Yeah. So we deal with children who are in 3rd to 12th grade standard in India. And India has a different context as compared to the US. So when talking about these schools in particular, they don't really have good internet speeds connectivity. They don't really have kind of good even computer training process in place, even for the teachers. So kind of thinking about it, like all the digital solutions need to be really, really simple and intuitive for them to use. So that was like one of the first understanding that we had. And the really innovative part of our process was around involving the disabled children themselves to be owning a part of the content development process. So what we did was we created audio-based SEMs, like special engagement modules. These are audio recorded, basically natural voice, like you can record it, but we developed our own proprietary content format, structure, methodologies. We also developed our test techniques to kind of how do we transcribe a diagrammatic information into text and then speak it out into the audio. So that was kind of the in-depth level of research that we did. The second type of special formatting with the content that we did was basically around creating examples which are relevant to our target population. So for example, color as an information is just not relevant to people who have been completely blind or born blind. So for them, if an example involves a lot of colors, they just don't make sense to it. Like, very simple. So in that sense, we created more examples, especially for the difficult topics. And what we did was we identified very communicative students in kind of higher grade, like 7th or 8th or 10th grade students who were very vocal with us. We tried to ask them, if you were to teach this topic, which example would you choose? So kind of we developed these repositories over time so as to pick and choose from and use the examples which would be most apt for them. So that was one way where we involved them in the content development. The other way that we involved them in the content development part, and where we are actually very different from our competitors, is kind of we developed an extensive testing mechanism. So when we made an audio resource, we kind of tested it out with at least 2 grade above for which the audio resource was made. So if we are making an audio material for 5th grade, we tested out with a 7th grade student, and then we went back and redid the entire content. So because of this processes in place, and because of these are slightly non-technology, but they are very important when you think about delivering technology adoption, or kind of delivering mobile phone adoption for just simple learning audio resources. So from that standpoint, when we compare our engagement levels with respect to our competitors, the competitors were at 30 to 40%, our resources stood at 95 to 98%. So because we customized so much with respect to what they really was relevant to them, we were able to deliver great content as well as great engagement levels.
Yeah. So, what is our, what kind of programs we're doing? So obviously there's no necessarily product with UNICEF. If I want to name some exciting innovations that we've made that are on a technological standpoint, going outside of just children with disabilities, talking about education in general, we do have innovation labs, and these have come up with extraordinary new technologies to kind of achieve their goal. And one of the things that I'd like to highlight is our new MOBI stations. So previously we had something called School in a Box, and a School in a Box was a big, literally, it is what it sounds like. It's a huge box, and inside they've got, papers, pencils, markers, paint, math books. It's got paintboard chalk, paint that you can paint on a wall and create a chalkboard out of anything. But then there are issues where, that may not necessarily work the best. So what we've also invented with, work from colleagues in country as well. So it's not just something that UNICEF is doing with international staff. We work closely with people and kids in country to assess these needs. It's something called MOBI Station. So it's basically an electronic school in a box where, it's got a solar powered laptop, and it's basically there to solve issues like teacher absenteeism, or teachers sometimes just don't show up. When you don't have access to these materials, everything can be online, can be compiled where, kids can teach themselves, and it can literally go anywhere, right? If they're solar powered, you can charge them and bring them up wherever you want. So that's one cool thing. That's an innovation in terms of technology. But when we're looking at ensuring quality education for children with disabilities, we really believe that there are a few key goals that we're looking at, and they're not necessarily, like I said, technology-based. What we look at as innovation is a little bit more than just the technology. So the first thing that we look for is to promote accessible and inclusive learning spaces, right? So it's making sure that, the schools are accessible when we're commuting them, when we're moving around inside the school environment, making sure that while they're at the school, they have access to safe water and sanitation, facilities within the school. Likewise, making sure the materials that are there are accessible to all of the students, and that they're in formats that meet, every child's needs. We're also there investing in teacher training for inclusive education, right? So like many of, everyone on this panel is saying, it's kind of the same goals, right, in a sense. Making sure that teachers know how to approach their education for children with disabilities. And we also take a multi-sectoral approach, which means there are a lot of barriers inside and outside of school that affect a child with disability being able to have a quality education, right? Making sure that they have the transportation that they need, making sure that social services can provide them with any assistive devices that they need, making sure that their health is taken care of, right? So all of these other factors is something that UNICEF also looks into. We also make sure that we involve the community, right? Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the community is invested and believes in the potential of a child with disabilities, as well as the parents. So those are two key factors that determine the success of an inclusive education. And then again, it's making sure that we collect data for evidence building and progress monitoring. We don't know if we're reaching all this, children that may need these resources if we don't know that they're there. We can't measure if we're providing the resources that they need if we're not able to accurately monitor progress. So those are some of the things that we look at. Those are our goals when we're talking about children with disabilities for UNICEF and for our programs.
Actually, that's a great segue into the next question. So, how is assessment and measurement of your impact changed your business model or your product model, if it has at all? And if so, could you touch upon if that process is currently happening or if it's something you're trying to change in the future?
So one of the things about innovation in education technology is that it takes a really long time to actually see impact outcomes. And so we've had to change a lot, and we use the Kellogg model. Our theory of change is that we can use outputs to then follow to see if we can get impact. So within 5 to 7 years, we would hopefully be able to see impact, but we're an early stage startup. We're only about 2.5 years old. Our product has actually only been in schools for about a year, so there's no way that we can measure impact. However, that is a huge problem for potential investors. So I'm raising a round of money right now, and all they want to see is impact, and I don't have anything to show them, so I have to measure outputs. So we can measure how many times teachers access our resources. We can measure how many kids are in our system. We can measure how many times teachers click on a certain kid's learning profile and reference it. We can collect data on the, we created a methodology for teachers to rate strategies so that we can collect data on that. So we know this strategy works 80% of the time for Johnny. We also know that it works 90% of the time for all of the dyslexics in our system. So we can use like that kind of data to show. However, it's been a huge change for me, particularly in raising money. So we're, like I said, we're early stage, and that's one of the first things investors want to hear. Unfortunately, we just can't measure that. So I just have to be kind of transparent and really figure out what it is that we can measure and what it is that we can track. So one of those things is using that data. So like you mentioned before, it's kind of like that marketing, right? Like, well, we can collect data and we can know exactly where teachers click the most, and we can know, exactly what strategies they're rating, and we can know, what apps they're downloading the most for kids with, like I said, dyslexia, or what strategy they're trying best for kids with, emotional disorders or severe behavioral problems. But we actually can't correlate those to student achievement yet. Like I said, our theory of change is that the more strategies teachers cohesively implement and the more that they collaborate around them, the faster kids will move, but we won't be able to prove that for at least 4 to 5 years, more years. We did apply for a federal grant that will maybe help us try to measure that, but I don't think we'll get it. I don't know, did that answer your question?
It did,
Okay.
thank you.
I definitely had a similar experience. So we started working on this in 2010 on terms of like how do we create more self-learning content based, and kind of it took us 1.5 years to even just boil down to like what are the techniques, what are the methodologies, what are the things that we need to focus on, testing and retesting, and then sending it out. What's the best way to deliver? What platforms do they use? So they use like Nokia feature phones, and not everybody has them. Some people use audio cassettes, and some people use CDs, and some people use Sony. So kind of like it was just all over the place, and we had to kind of think about, okay, how do we service this wide range of different formats, and kind of how do we put it out there? How do we ensure that we are just creating the right resources and using the right techniques? That took us 1.5 years in itself, because we spent time kind of sitting in the classes along with the children, trying to understand, okay, how the teachers are teaching them. What questions do these kids ask? Has the teacher answered these questions? And later on, like, is someone else explaining to the child? Sometimes that's better way of teaching, and you also kind of understand, okay, what's the people dynamics going on? Which teacher is better, which teacher is not, what are the techniques, and kind of use that. Then we also interviewed caregivers, parents, and even mentors for the child, and kind of understood, okay, if they come to a problem and ask you a problem, how do you give them the solution? How do you communicate it? So that communication format, we try to derive some commonalities out of it and try to incorporate into our material. So basically doing this in-depth research and trying to just understand the entire dynamics that's going on, that itself took a lot of time. Then the other issue that came around, and which goes back to the point again for measurement and what really can you prove, is our theory of change was that one thing that we realized is that these kids, because they are so heavily dependent on another person during their learning process, and the lack of technologies and the lack of other digital resources available to them in those particular schools, they are not really confident about themselves. They feel like they're always going to depend on some other person in their life. And that's not a good way to go forward in life, because as the kid becomes an adult, they just don't even want to search for a job or look for a job or even do something with their lives. So our theory of change was, if we created more self-learning resources, that the children right from the younger stage could kind of have the feeling that they can accomplish things on their own, along with technology, rather than just depending on one or two people whom they trust, but they can also use some technology and do things, then they can just become much more self-confident, and then they can also start really exploring things out of their own, or start demanding stuff that we need this, we want this. Like, they're very shy to even interact with you. So that's the kind of theory of change that we had. And again, like, what data points can you really measure over time? We are now 5 years in operations. So now we have actually seen that some of the children, they've actually become more vocal in their opinion. So for example, we developed resources around their course content, and then we also developed some resources around short stories. We developed a kind of like a mobile app and an online game platform which was all audio controlled, that the children would play with audio in very simple games. And then after that, what request they asked us was to just record a dictionary as it is. Like, they didn't have any audio which had dictionary. And we were like, yeah, why would you record a dictionary? Like, we didn't think about it. But then that was a request that they asked us. And the reason they asked us was that, number one, they felt more comfortable working with us, they could trust us. Number two is that also that they've probably become more vocal, that they can just talk out to people. So the other things that the teachers also started doing after this was to involve kind of like group interaction classes. And that's something like based or also on a resource, like we had some activities planned, like, for your English language fluency, you should just go and speak to people and tell them what's the best news that you've heard today. Like, as simple as that. And try to speak in English. So that is another part of that the language of instruction is local language. And India, as you know, has like tons and tons of language. Like, on a 10 rupee note, you have 10 rupees written in like 17 different languages. And that's just the major ones. So kind of like each of these schools in different regions have their own language of instruction, so they are not even fluent in English, which kind of also hinders later on in the life kind of looking for options for the job. So that is another part. We focus in our audio resources, and all of our content, whether on games or other apps, is kind of thinking about bilingual. So we had both the local language as well as the English language put together. And that is again which came, and that was a result because that we started measuring these impact studies, which was like, okay, what do we want to change? And then one was self-confidence, but we really couldn't measure it. Then the other one's, okay, what else we can do is like communicating in English. So how often they have started communicating in English? So create that. That was another kind of data point that we started creating it. There is no objective way to measure it, really. You have to kind of do some field observations. You have to talk to teachers. You can start communicating with the students and understand, okay, what was this child's ability to communicate in English 6 months ago versus now? So that's something that you can kind of rate on. And because we started doing all these impact studies, we started developing new categories where we wanted to focus on, and then we expanded our resources. So, I do agree, it takes a lot of time. Like, it takes us 1.5 years to even get to that stage, to start doing impact studies, first of all, and then to understand, okay, which parameters should we measure and which data points should we collect.
So, Isabel, I know that this, UNICEF does this on a much larger scale, but maybe you could talk a little bit just about the assessment process that you go through, maybe like the general characteristics of how you determine if a program is successful or not, obviously on such a scale.
Yeah. So obviously within every country, our assessment is completely different. We look to the community that we're working with, what are the needs that need to be addressed, and a lot of the times it's, a lot of our work, because we are a UN humanitarian agency, again, a lot of what we do is we partner with amazing nonprofits that do a lot of this impact research. We work with other UN agencies that where we, the UNDP, World Health Organization, to get a lot of our data and these statistics. We are working on a top-down as well as a bottom-up approach, and we also, have an equity-based approach. So top-down, we're working with governments to ensure that, there are enough legislative policies put in place. When we look at countries, even like Ireland, for example, and UNICEF may not work there, but when we're looking, it really needs cooperations from a top-down level as well. For example, in Ireland, children with disabilities in high school don't end up taking all the same classes as a lot of their peers do, simply because they have a disability. In China, when we're looking at in college, there's a lot of people with disabilities who are not allowed to take majors within many fields of science simply because it's seen as a waste on them. So, really taking that from a top-down approach, making sure that these governments are taking the time to find out their population, where their gaps are in terms of where do they need to start, implementing more stronger programs. Because at the end of the day, our goal isn't providing a product or a resource, it's building sustainability and resiliency, right? So at the end of the day, our goal is to work ourselves out of a job. And then we also work from the bottom-up approach. So we're working with community leaders, we're working with faith-based organizations in the area, we're working with families to make sure that any stigma that's around it, to reassess, the conversation on children with disabilities and education in general, right? When we're looking at even, education between boys and girls, we'll see that girls don't have access to, school. More in general, girls are more at risk of not going to school and completing their education than boys, and that's a lot of addressing social norms, and then at the same time also looking at what legislations and is there, and a multi-sectoral approach, again, looking at that, we're also making sure that we're taking care of, their health, making sure that the government is able to supply any resources that they need, making sure that, social services are there, working with law enforcement if that's necessary for any of our issues. So in terms of assessing all these data, we take a huge, it's a big process, we have a lot of help, and we've got amazing minds that are doing a lot of these impact studies and these research and looking at our programs, reevaluating them, looking where things need to be picked, start over, where things need to be addressed, and it comes down to, individuals who are creating programs, like the people sitting next to me, right, where they're looking at a specific program and they've got a task and they're evaluating, is this successful? Why are X amount of kids, only 10% of all children with disabilities are in schools. And of this number, half of who begin actually complete their primary education, right? So many are leaving after only a few months or years, and they're gaining very little from their experience. And that's something that you can only, find out after being in a community and taking those impact studies, doing surveys and taking that data. So that's a lot of where our numbers and, studies come from. And we're looking at, are we doing this the right way, right?
So actually kind of related to that, Abhishek and Melissa, what have you done in the past to kind of understand more about the problems that are faced by communities that you don't necessarily belong to? I know you mentioned that you taught earlier, Melissa, and how did you work with them to kind of evolve your tools to better address their needs?
Yeah, sure. So even though I was a teacher in a Title I school for 9 years, one of the first things I learned was that I did not represent all teachers, right? So when, especially in New York City public schools, and it's the same in Boston, it's actually the same almost everywhere, schools are so different. So I taught in South Brooklyn, and I went to a school in the Bronx, which is less than a mile away, maybe like a mile and 1.2 miles. And it was a completely different experience than what I had ever experienced. And I'm talking about, they didn't have an inclusion model. All of their kids who had diagnosed disabilities were on basically like the roof. They had like an attic almost that they like made classrooms for. And it was the same school district. And, and all the teachers were, they were loving and super committed and amazing, but they just didn't have the system set up. And this is in the same district, right? And so one of the things that I had to learn, especially within the first year So I created my startup while I was still teaching, and then I left to pursue it for full time. And once I did that, the first thing I had to do was just go into as many schools as I possibly could and talk to as many teachers who taught in those classrooms, right? So I went to one school where they had an 8+ program in which they took all the kids who couldn't graduate from 8th grade and brought them to the high school because they were too old to be in the middle school still. And technically they were all kids with special needs, but they didn't really address them as kids with special needs. They addressed them as like the bad kids who like couldn't pass 8th grade, and they like could no longer be in a middle school because it was just inappropriate. And so like having those different experiences was something that was super important, and that's also one of the things that I learned. So I'm not a technologist, and I built a technology product, which is kind of strange, but that was one of the things I learned from the technologists that I partner with, was to actually go in and talk to customers and talk to your users all the time. So even when you put out like a beta product, the first thing you should do is just get customer feedback, user feedback. And so the other thing that we learned was that first year teachers did not behave the same as 25-year veteran teachers. I didn't have 25 years of experience as a teacher, so like I didn't know what that was like, even though I felt like I kind of knew or remembered what it was like to be a first-year teacher. So just going in and talking to users all the time, and then also we asked kids. We created a bunch of surveys and asked kids who were in special ed classes to tell us about their experience. And one of the biggest things that we got back was that just people don't understand me. Teachers, my parents, my friends, like no one understands me. And that was something that we really took to heart when we made iterations on our product for the child, so that one of the things, like I said, I have an app on my phone that tells me everything about everything, but why don't I know what to do with this kid who has ADHD, and why does no one understand him after he's been in school for 7 years or 8 years or 10 years or whatever. So just really understanding that population is going in and talking to them, sitting in classrooms. That's something in education a lot of people assume. If you've been in school, then you know what it's like to be in a classroom, which is completely untrue. If you talk to any teacher, if any of you have teacher friends, if you've been a teacher, you understand. So really just getting intimate with that population.
And actually, as a follow-up, so what was the initial reaction to, like, I know you've been working for like a year now with the product.
Yeah.
What has been the initial reaction to that?
Yeah, so we get, it's crazy. It's like totally unexpected reactions, and then also really positive reactions. So we get a lot of really good feedback from our teachers on our content, how it can help students, how using technology to carry that kind of professional memory from year to year, so that you don't start off fresh. Or with a blank slate, when you should be able to get this child in your class and know what works for him already and what doesn't. That's been really helpful. We did get really interesting feedback from teachers, like they just wanted a simple anecdotal function, just to like write a quick comment, which like I never thought of. But that's something we get from almost every single teacher that we had surveyed in the first year. And then the other thing was, does anyone know what an IEP is? The individualized, I know you know. There's the individualized education plan. It's like that legal document that you get when you get diagnosed with a disability, and this is like the biggest contentious piece of what's happening in public schools for kids and parents with special needs. It's the legal document that basically creates all of the problems. But the problem is because it hasn't been innovated, and it was created in 1975, and it hasn't been thought of twice since. And it just it hasn't kept up with things. So one of the biggest things our teachers say is, when can you replace the IEP? And I always joke and say that if I had a dime for every time a teacher asked me that, I could self-fund my startup. But so that's something we're looking to do. It's a really big, lofty goal, because it requires legislative change and compliance change. And but that's something that we are looking to do. We do want to be able to take what teachers are doing every day and also satisfy compliance on the legal side.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with it, like feedback, and you need to just test. The more you do, the better you would be. And in fact, I totally agree with you. You sit in one classroom with one teacher, you sit in another classroom with another teacher, it's a different experience. even if they teach the same subject, same grade, same material, it's a completely different experience. So yeah, that was a very eye-opener experience for me as well. We actually did a lot of user understanding in place, kind of developing user personas for our work, because what we realized was like, okay, I do have specs, so when I don't wear it, yes, I cannot see, probably will not see all of you. So from that experience, yeah, I do have some limited experience of how is it like without vision, but I don't know what it's like to be born without vision at all and not being able to see anything. So from that perspective, what we went in is like, we are the students and we want to learn from them. So just kind of, the first point was kind of just go to them, ask them very open-ended, simple questions, and just listen to them. And that, just the simple act of listening to them and let them ramble on to the stories or anecdotes or whatever they want to do. The thing is that just forms the initial connection with you. Because many people, they just want to know some 10 questions and they want those 10 questions to be answered. And sometimes while working with, especially children with disabilities, you want to form a connection with them so that they give you feedback and they're able to speak out, especially with marginalized communities. So that was the first thing that we did, was kind of just saying hi, saying what's the issue you face, what is good, what is bad, tell us everything, tell us whatever you want to talk about, and kind of just nice and easy and flowing. And just listening gives the other person that you empathize with them. So that's number one. Number two was kind of involving them as an ownership, like making them feel an ownership in the part of the process. So whether it's in the test and dev to kind of have, oh yeah, I want this feature. Like, I mean, for your example, if the teachers told them that they want this feature and then the next day they open and they see that feature, they feel like, oh yeah, they've listened to us, they've had this feature, so I can control, or I can at least tell where this thing should go. And similar in our case, in terms of the feedback that we got from the students is that we really need to slow down when we record these audio recordings. So it was funny because even if I'm speaking at this pace, this sometimes was very fast for them to understand and comprehend. Especially because we were switching the languages. That was why they had asked us to actually slow down. So that was one of the key things that we learned, and had we not gotten this feedback from them, our resources would also probably stand at 30 to 40% engagement levels as the other resources. So that was kind of very important factors, like even the small innocent things that we take for granted sometimes end up being one of the most important factors for user experience. Conduct as many interviews as you can, and once you have a connection with them, the users will open out to you much easily. Because they can see the change being happening. And the third part is, don't be afraid to ask for help. Even from your users, if it's something like some problem that you are facing, and I couldn't solve it because I was not in their shoes, but I could ask them, okay, if I don't know how to explain this diagram or this concept, how would you explain it to your peers? And let them explain it to the way they want. You talk to 10 students, and then you just take out the best of everything, and you got a solution right there and then for your content as well. So in some cases, even then asking them, even how they would explain, makes them feel like that they still have an ownership and a part to play. As well as it also solves your problem because you're not assuming things, but you're actually asking them how they would do it. So these are like 3 things that we did, right? In fact, to form a connection with them and to make them feel that they're involved in the process. The other part of the question was,
how did their kind of perception of it change, if it did at all, and what were their reactions to the product beyond the assessments that they gave you?
right. So that is actually very interesting. And in the initial reaction, what happened was when we first, after 1.5 years, we first launched our first module. We said, okay, this is great. You can please do, play it, enjoy it. And we didn't find students really engaging with it. And what we learned from that part of the process was that even though we had asked them to do so, their teachers didn't endorse our product. So kind of it was like teacher endorsements drive student adoption. And even understanding that part in the school, how things move, that is very essential as well, because ultimately you want students to use it. So what we did then in the next stage, we just asked some teachers to play some of the audio resources in their classes and just have students listen to it. And if they like it, great. And once we started doing that, and once the teachers had said it, like, yes, you should use this, or you should try it out, the students started adopting it, and then they started referring or talking about it with each other. So the point here being in when you start your Edtech, and if you have kind of like multiplayer system where there are different roles that are interacting, you need to figure out who drives adoption and who is the key influencer. So in our case, for our model, it turned out to be it was the teacher. Once teacher endorsed, then the children could then take it forward. This also made sense in our thing because think about it this way. When I talked about earlier that the student needs a teacher to basically learn from maps and diagrams and need a lot of involvement from the teacher perspective. So the student trusts the teacher a lot. Rather than trusting us, the student would trust the teacher. So from that standpoint, it just helped us to drive adoption once we involved teachers as well. So that was kind of, that changed the initial reaction later on.
So Isabel, maybe in more of a general sense, what kind of different stakeholders does UNICEF work with? You talked a little bit about like the top-down versus bottom-up approach. And when it comes to feedback, do you think that that top-down approach is something that UNICEF uses more frequently or more bottom-up?
So I think at the end of the day when we're talking about, I mean, both are equally important, right? So you can't say, it's more important that we work with governments than work with the communities, because at the end of the day we can see in a lot of countries where the laws are in place but nothing's being followed through, right? And so that also has to do with a lot of bottom-down approach, right? Developing the capacity of institutions, so like the law system, whether judges are being trained on convicting crimes, whether teachers are showing up and doing their jobs, right? So that's infrastructure, building capacity there. But then also we face a lot of issues in terms of the initial reaction of proposed changes, right, from communities. And when we're looking at children with disabilities, a lot of the times they're feared, they're outcasted, they're rejected by their communities. They're seen as they're either contagious or bad luck, something that no one spends time on. They're really, it's a huge bottom-up approach, and so it takes a lot of working with those key influencers, right? And that's what I mean when I say we're working with community leaders. Who are the people that are going to really drive change? And so I have this one story that I'm kind of thinking of in my head. It's a story that shows how connected a lot of these issues are. So UNICEF does a lot of vaccinations. In fact, we've vaccinated over 40% of the world's children, and one of our biggest successes has been with polio vaccinations. So polio has been eradicated in many countries, and a lot of it has been due to our success in keeping those vaccinations coming. And in one case, there was a child who had acquired polio, had become, acquired a disability, and needed a wheelchair. And there was also at that time, I don't know if maybe some of you guys had heard it, a local religious leader had decided to say that these vaccinations were actually causing their girls to become unable to conceive in later on, or some kind of truth that was completely inaccurate. But because he was a community leader, or not necessarily really seen strongly in the community, but was really loud, it kind of changed perception. Many people were refusing vaccinations, and so that one kid that I mentioned earlier worked with UNICEF, visiting families, visiting communities, and really see that's the idea of working with communities. So using an individual who has a voice, right? We're not speaking for children with disabilities. They have a voice, they have a story, and allowing them to use that to influence their communities, to change perceptions. That individual was a big reason why UNICEF was able to successfully come into communities and vaccinate children. regardless. And that's happened, same thing with all of our programs, right? It's making sure that the capacity is there by the government, that everything that needs to be provided for is happening, but also making sure that from the bottom up, right, we're addressing any of those stigmas that are there. We're changing the local conversation. We're addressing social norms, which is what they are, and we can even find them here in the U.S. If we wanted to. This isn't something that negative, harmful social norms in particular. So this is something that UNICEF definitely does to help address a lot of these issues, and so there are definitely always initial reactions that are negative, where communities are not receptive to new ideas or to approaches. But it takes both levels to really achieve accomplish a huge goal like that.
Great, thank you. Yeah. So I do have more questions, but first we did want to open it up a little bit. So first, if we could give a hand to the panelists for. So does anyone have any questions from the audience?
Just a general question. What incorporation do you all have for nonprofits? Got incorporation versus regular LLC?
Yeah, so I'll go first. So actually currently right now I'm still an LLC, but we are in the process of transitioning to a B Corp. So we will be a benefits corporation. It's just kind of the way in which, so we graduated from an accelerator program here in Boston called Learn Launch, which is only for education technology companies and startups, which is really great. We offer internships if anybody is interested. The way in which we did the accelerator, we wanted to wait to transition just for tax purposes, but we have to be, if we're going to take on any outside investment, especially from angel investors or VC, we have to be either a C Corp or a B Corp.
We are a charitable trust, so we run as a non-profit.
Yeah, so UNICEF is, we're not a nonprofit, we're not 501c3, we're a UN humanitarian agency, so in that sense we're an intergovernmental organization, an IGO, we're not an NGO, that's a nonprofit. But what's interesting, so the US fund for UNICEF, UNICEF USA, we're a national committee of UNICEF, so we don't have any of our education programs or nutrition programs operating here in the United States. The only time UNICEF was actually ever here was during Hurricane Katrina. For a couple of reasons. One, UNICEF has to be invited to a country before we can work there. So that's probably why we don't work everywhere, right? A lot of countries have the capacity to address these issues by themselves. But the US Fund for UNICEF is a registered 501c3. So we are a national committee of the US Fund, same with UNICEF UK, UNICEF Canada. That's what enables us to fundraise, educate and advocate on behalf of our international programs. So that allows us to make any donations to tax deductible here in the US. So maybe that answers your question, yeah.
Sorry, this is two from. First is just I'm curious, how has cognitive science at all affected educational technology in your context? And then also how, because of these developments in technology, obviously you've stated there's definitely a change in methodology. Students are consulted for their creation, and I'm curious what other trends are coming about that are shifting the paradigm in how education is conducted in a classroom and on a larger scale carried out in organizational functions.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So first, neuroscience and cognitive science, there's a lot of research that's coming out. So we actually partner with the Harvard Graduate School of Education, the Mind, Brain, and Education program. And if you want to learn anything about kind of some of the trends, Todd Rose just came out with a new book called The End of Average. And it's a fabulous book, and it just talks about how our entire educational system is built off of this idea of standardization, and that there's an average, right? And so that, like, if you don't read by this time, then you're below average, or if you whatever, don't finish these amount of math problems in, this set context, then you're below average. And basically he just blows that entire idea out of the water. And all of the neuroscience points to neurodiversity now, and that all people's minds are different in different areas of cognition. So he writes, there's this really great analogy at the beginning of his book about the Air Force building planes. So I think it was back in the late 60s or early 70s, the Air Force built a bunch of planes based on the average size human. And then they realized that for whatever reason, pilots weren't flying as well. And they like checked out all of these planes, and they did a bunch of studies, and they realized that they built all of these dimensions that were based on the average size person. And basically they built it to fit no one. Because more than, I think it was like 97% of the pilots didn't fit the average size, whatever. So there's a huge trend in that in cognitive science for learning. It's the same thing. And then what was the second part of your question? Sorry. Okay.
How these technologies are changing the methodology, like the pedagogy, how people are taught, and how educational institutions like organize around this new methodology.
Yeah, so I think it's changing in two very specific ways, and one is the environment that we think of as school. So, schools were built on this factory model, but a lot of people are realizing that, like, if you look at just this room right here, this room looks nothing like a K-12 classroom, right? So, like, people are realizing that we should change the environments in which schools actually, like, look and feel. And, if you go to, like, a co-working space, right, like, it's, or, like, WeWork or something, like, it's open and bright and, like, people can do whatever they want. It's, like, very flexible. That's very different than how K-12 schools are set up. So people are looking that way. So that's one way, is the environment. And then adaptive learning and how teachers are actually teaching. We can get a lot more information right at our fingertips to be able to change curriculum right then and there. So there's a lot of programs that are doing what's called adaptive learning. So if you take a reading program, for example, or maybe we could talk about Alex by McGraw-Hill. They do an adaptive learning platform. So like you can use artificial intelligence and machine learning to actually understand where kids are missing gaps and then be able to change your path of instruction that way. And so it's changed to what's called this blended model of learning, blended learning. So teachers do a lot more of blending technology and classroom. A lot of people get nervous that the teacher is going to be replaced. The teacher will never be replaced. But blended learning is replacing things so that you can like put stuff on video and they can watch it at home, and then they can come in and sit down with the teacher and learn things.
Yeah, I mean, I totally, what I see it as is like education is going to become more like a community building and a life building exercise over a period of time. So people want to get together, they want to work on a project, think about an outcome, and basically, yes, you have all these books and other resources in place. These are all secondary sources of information. I mean, these are always accessible to you in today's internet. So I think what's more important is to develop more kind of team approach and kind of develop more kind of how do you build stuff together. So that's where it goes to the blended environment, is that when you come even to a classroom, you're discussing with teachers on how to solve this problem further. Not that the teacher is kind of teaching with a kind of like chalk and board. So from a perspective of the shift in how it is delivered, that's how I see it happening. The second part of it is, and I think you can decide how you want to take on this, but what I feel is that the technology and the skill sets are evolving at a much faster pace than education or the resources are trying to keep up. And that's the part of the process, that's the trend which is actually affecting the adoption of blended learning or other models in place. So think about it, like Apple just launched Swift programming, a new programming language, right? And developers are using it. You are going to get, I mean, GitHub and kind of like other sources, and how many schools actually kind of adopt these kind of things in their learning programs? I like right now, if I'm kind of trying to hire a volunteer, someone who knows like Python is still very old now, but kind of MongoDB, kind of Node.js, whatever, but the school environment doesn't teach it. The child has, the person is basically learning on his own, or kind of learning in a group or meetup or kind of online learning and getting it out, like a developer community. So I believe, and not just for software, like you look at 3D printing, you look at even food technology, you look at like all the other kind of industries, like drones, how much of it, Internet of Things, like how much of that pieces are we really incorporating it in our learning? Does that make sense? So what I feel is that because the technology is going to just, the disruption is just going to take at a much faster rate than we're going to be able to adopt it, we would have to learn outside beyond our school. And startups or even platforms that can help that, they're going to have a much more leverage in the future. That's what I feel from a content perspective.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add to that because I think that's so important is that one of the things that's happening in K-12 is like there's this like stifling of learning. Kids don't like high school, they don't like school, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things I see that's a huge opportunity is self-directed learning, right? So you find something that you're interested in. Technology has enabled you to figure out how to do that, whether it's just from Googling, how do I learn photography, to actually, getting a class online or, using technology. I think that there's a huge opportunity in that. I don't know how much we'll leverage it, but I think that there's a huge opportunity in that, especially before kids even graduate high school.
And yeah, I'm just curious to hear from you, kind of like, going back to the question is like, how technology can enable your part of the problem in solving or promoting education forward?
Yeah. So I think, I'm going to be honest with all of you. I've never worked in education. I have no background on creating education programs. I just kind of, I'm a generalist. I kind of know a little bit about every of UNICEF's programs, which is a lot. So I know a little bit about everything.
It's okay, that's how innovation happens.
Yeah, that's how innovation happens. Yeah, so how UNICEF uses technology, I think first and foremost, our biggest, when we're looking, for example, like the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that is a big thing that just came out in September, that is driving the international focus on, solving some of the biggest issues in the world. One of those goals being, access to education. So right now, the global issue is providing access to education, and not just getting kids in school, having them have access to school, making sure that it's quality education, making sure that all these kids can afford education, making sure that their schools are safe, making sure that kids, when they're at school, when there's a teacher at school, they have the nutrition that they need to learn. So there's a lot of things. So when we're looking at a technology, is the way that we're really looking, when we're working in really remote areas, technology can become hard. So it's not necessarily finding the most up-to-date issue, right? Or how can we get the fanciest gadget into the classroom? It's how can we use technology to help with, an issue that can seem really simple, right? How do we get kids to school? We're living in a world where more people have cell phones than have toilets, right? It's absolutely crazy, and it may not be with education in general, but for example, UNICEF has done things like in conflict or during emergencies when kids are separated from families. It used to be a huge process of how do we reunite families? How do we get a kid who is crying, may not be able to say their name, can't speak, they're kind of traumatized after anything that happened, and find their family. This process could take weeks, and that's a long time. We used to write everything by hand, put them into a center, and if the information came along, someone had to report, someone had to get all the information from their kid, their name, their family, where they were last separated. But we've developed something where we can just take a picture of the kid. That picture goes into a database, and automatically families can come into the center and we can look up and share that picture and that information with different centers during an emergency, and that has sped up the process of reuniting families. So technology has a huge role in the work that we're doing, especially when we have all of these new tools. But it takes a lot of innovation. How do we take something, it's not this grand software, this new scheme, or the best way to analyze and find our statistic. It's how do we take a big problem and find a simple solution, and technology can really simplify a lot of things, which is what UNICEF is doing, and I'm sure that applies in all of our programs, especially education.
Well, that's the end of our discussion today. Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today, and offering your insight.
Thank you so much for having us.